Okay, and we will go ahead and get started. The people are still coming in, I know, but for the sake.
You're going to introduce what we're doing.
Exactly.
Okay, and you remember that I can't read these little icons at all.
Yes, yes. So Lauren, I'll let you know what's happening. Let me just sort of welcome everybody. So good evening to everyone who's here and everyone who's joining on YouTube. My name is Judy Kitt. I'm the current president of the Foundation for Mind Being Research, or FMBR. I know that some of you are new to us, so I just want to let you know that we were founded 40 years ago by scientists and artists and healers who were really interested in exploring the nature of human consciousness through the lens of science and spirituality and ancient wisdom traditions. So I encourage you to check us out at fmbr.org. So if you're on Zoom and you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the bottom of your screen. There's a thing that says participants. You can click on that, and then there'll be an option at the bottom to raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. If you prefer, you can also type your question in the chat or the Q&A. And then I will just read it. And if you're watching the YouTube, the live stream on YouTube, you can type your questions in the comment section, and Mary will be monitoring those, and she'll text them to me, and we'll get your questions answered. So we're very honored to have our long-term friend, Russell Targ, with us this evening. A few months back, he did an interview with Jonathan Womack, who's back east, and he created a video of the interview, and he added some of his own animations, made it very interesting. So Russell thought it would be good to show it to you here, and then take your questions afterwards. And Jonathan actually does a really nice introduction of Russell right off the bat, so I'm going to let him do that. And I will go ahead and get that going.
You might tell them this film runs about 70 minutes.
Okay. I think you just did. Can you see this?
I see it.
Okay.
My guest today is Russell Targ, laser physicist and ESP researcher. Russell began his scientific career in the 1950s as a graduate student in physics at Columbia University. He pioneered the development of the laser, and in 1972, Russell co-founded the Stanford Research Institute's Stargate program, where he spent 10 years conducting remote viewing experiments. Along the way, he designed an ESP teaching machine and pitched his invention to the father of modern rockets, furthered the advancement of non-local consciousness, and accepted an invitation to present his research to a rousing audience at the Kremlin. Russell returned to his optical roots in 1983, conducting laser air turbulence experiments for Lockheed Martin until 1998. Today, Russell continues his work in the scientific field as a consultant and speaker. He is the author of The Reality of ESP, The End of Suffering, Limitless Mind, and a memoir, Do You See What I See? So without further ado, let's welcome Russell to the show. How are you doing today, Russell?
I'm very happy to be with you. I'm always happy to have an opportunity to describe the exciting time we had at Stanford Research Institute during the Cold War. My job as a physicist was to explore the limits, if any, of the remote viewing that was appearing during that period. We're working for the CIA and for NASA, and everyone was very excited that people in the laboratory seemed able to describe what was going on in distant places. That was especially interesting to the CIA, as you might discover. And what we found, the most interesting thing we found, is that people are able to quiet their mind and describe and experience what's going on at a distant location. We call that ability remote viewing, and we found that most people could do it. We had some very talented people, but by and large, anybody who walked into my laboratory was able to do remote viewing pretty well. So it's not limited to a special few people. And the most interesting thing we discovered from a year of working is that the accuracy and the reliability of the remote viewing does not degrade as you look further and further away. Psychic hide and go seek, where the subject would sit with me in the laboratory and other people, the general, the colonel, my partner, Hal Putoff, would go hide someplace. And I would say, here we are, John, we're ready to go. Tell me about the surprising images that show up in your awareness.
So there was no aptitude test that you ran first and sort of give you an idea of a person's ability to do this?
In the beginning, we thought that it would be limited to a special few. By the end of the program, we were working with 6 Army recruits that I just chose off the floor of the gymnasium, and they were significant at odds of 1 in a million. So people were very surprised at the good results we had in general. But the important result is that in terms of modern physics, we would call remote viewing a non-local ability. It's definitely independent of the distance. In our experiments in the beginning, we would have people describe, where are you hiding in Palo Alto, as I sit in the laboratory in Menlo Park. And that worked very well. And Ingo Swann was able to look into a future atomic bomb test in China. And he could say, we of course didn't know it was a bomb test. All we're given is coordinates. Here you are, Ingo, tell us what's going to happen at this location 3 days from now. And he said, I see a pyrotechnic display in the sky, and there are a line of trucks, beautiful pyrotechnics. I need colored pencils, I'll draw that. That was enough to tell the CIA that the bomb test they were interested in would take place, but would fail. So Ingo had no problem describing what's going on 3 days in the future, 10,000 miles away. We had a program based on an ESP teaching machine that I invented, and I showed that to Werner von Braun before the program got started, and it was von Braun's very excellent performance with my ESP game that allowed me to meet the administrator of NASA, Jim Fletcher, and got the program started. But the ESP teaching machine was the key to starting our program. What we found with Ingo is that although he could look in China and see into the future, one day when we had our program to teach people how to improve their scores with the ESP teaching machine, my NASA contract monitor asked Ingo, can you take a look at Jupiter? We're going to be having a flyby with the Pioneer leaving shortly. What do you see new in Jupiter? And Ingo said, well, as I take a puff on my cigar, it looks to me like there's a interesting ring of ice crystals all the way around the planet. And George said, oh, you must be thinking of Saturn. And Ingo said, I've been looking at the solar system my entire life. You gotta believe me, I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. And indeed, 8 months later, when they got pictures back from Jupiter, Ingo was the first person in the world who knew there was a ring of ice crystals around it. And the point of my story is that he had no more trouble describing something 500 million miles away than he did to describe something across the street in Menlo Park or 1,000 miles away, 10,000 miles away in China. The distance did not matter, and the physicists were confident it didn't matter. But there were other people who investigated things, and we had enough data. So we're now making, even though I'm a physicist, I can still make the outrageous claim that consciousness permeates everything. Now, it doesn't sound like a physics statement, and I'm only a slightly reconciled logical positivist. So that means I really have to see the data, and I'm a reformed logical positivist because I no longer feel I have to burn the believers. That was only in college. But the idea that consciousness permeates everything means that no matter how large or how small your consciousness can be there. And we actually have evidence to go with the 500 million mile case. In the early 1900s, some theosophical researchers, Madame Blavatsky, who was the head of the Theosophical Society, was also a highly intelligent psychic woman, said, "We're now hearing a lot about the periodic table. I think you two," naming Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, two world famous psychics of the time, "why don't you take a look at some atoms and we can make a psychic periodic table?" Isn't that an interesting idea? What does it look like psychically? So Leadbeater got a block of paraffin, because paraffin is 99% hydrogen. And he said, as I look at this paraffin, I see these two intersecting triangles representing the hydrogen. And in the corner of each triangle, there's a ball. And I think that's like a fundamental atomic mass in the corner of those. And the balls are held together by bands of energy. And that's what he drew at the beginning of the 20th century. 65 short years later, people began to talk about quarks and gluons. So on the right side of my slide, I show a 21st century drawing of a hydrogen atom, has two up quarks and a down quark connected by gluons. So 100 years after Leadbeater is describing the fundamental atomic units held together by energy, we now have gotten so well educated that they're actually called gluons and quarks. That's the advance we made. But the point is, Leadbeater was the kind of person who could see anything all over the universe, including down to atomic levels. And this is a published document. I got this from the Lucifer magazine, which is a theosophical journal published in 1895, because I wanted to have the original. So in 1895, the proton wasn't discovered until 1919 by Rutherford. Quarks were a century away, but the drawing that Leadbeater made greatly represents what was going to be appearing in books 100 years after he drew that. So that was a remarkable piece of microscopic remote viewing. So it gives you the idea that his consciousness indeed permeates everything. There is no known limit to what you're able to see. So the physicist, I spent my life doing laser. I'm basically a laser guy. I spent 15 years before my mid-course correction to remote viewing, doing laser stuff. I was the pioneer with the laser. And after I left remote viewing, I was putting lasers on airplanes. I created a remote sensing laboratory at Lockheed. And what we were remote sensing is invisible wind shear and air turbulence. And I could use a powerful laser to see the invisible wind shear. So I've been looking for invisible stuff my whole life. And what we know now, though, the point of this idea is that psychic functioning is not weak and unreliable. Psychic functioning is powerful. And as you'll see in a bit, it was reliable and we could use it for all sorts of things. But here in my little introduction, we're able to use remote viewing to see 500 million miles to Jupiter, or all the way into a block of paraffin to see the atomic structure. And this is data that exactly corresponds to the contemporary drawings of a hydrogen atom.
Now, do you know, did NASA ask Ingo Swann if he would take a look at other bodies such as the moon or Mars?
Not as far as I know. We weren't doing that. This was just a one-off. Hesderts was very supportive of our program, and he was just hanging out with me and Ingo, playing with the ESP teaching machine, which you'll see shortly. And he said, by the way, we're about to launch the Pioneer. Would you take a look at Jupiter? Ingo said, sure I would. And I'll show you that in a little bit. So here are the four musketeers. You've got two laser physicists, a guy from the CIA, and the most psychic person in the world. I bet your ESP allows you to tell who those people are without any further ado. The guy on the left is my colleague, Hal Putoff. He's a laser researcher, PhD from Stanford. The guy with the sunglasses, of course, is CIA contract monitor, Kit Green, who is very supportive of our work, is a physician, head of LSD, that is to say the Life Science Division at CIA. This leaning tower is me 40 years ago, and the guy on the right is Pat Price, the most psychic man in the world at that time. And we're standing in front of a glider, or near a glider, that we were going to fly around to see if Pat Price was able to see things from inside the glider. And of course, he had no trouble doing that. So here we are in one of our peaceful meeting rooms. The guy on the left is Robert Monroe, who wrote Journeys Out of the Body. And Bob and I were friends before this program because I was interested in this out-of-body research. In fact, I have a lifetime interest in psychic abilities. As a teenager, I was on the stage doing pretend magic. And I did that until I realized that from time to time on stage, I would have a correct impression of the life stream of somebody I was talking to in the audience. And as a young scientist, I became more interested in the real data of parapsychological research than in fooling people doing tricks on the stage. But our contract monitors were very happy that I had a background in magic because they felt that I was less likely to be tricked by a visiting magician. So that all went very well. So Bob Monroe was interested in our work because the remote viewing he felt was very much like the out-of-body experience, and we agreed with that. In remote viewing, we were eager for a person to simply quietly describe what's going on in the distance. I did not want my remote viewer to separate her consciousness from her body because I'm not qualified to help somebody get reintegrated. And it would be the end of our program if our viewer went to the management and said, Targ separated my consciousness from my body and I'm not able to get integrated again. That would just be the end of the remote viewing program. So we were very sanitary in the effect I would ask people to see, tell me what you see on your mental screen. But with experienced viewers, I would go with them and we could have a trip and describe together what was going on. So as though remote viewing is on a continuum where the nice sanitary remote viewing we did at SRI is my asking you to quiet your mind and tell me about the surprising images that appear. Those are the magic words. I don't say, where is hell, or what's the object, or what's going on. I say, we have a target today. Tell me about the surprising images that appear in your awareness. And by the way, you can't do that wrong because only you know what's in your awareness. So it was a very friendly, unchallenging thing. So people felt quite comfortable, like I'm not asking them to do something crazy. I say, close your eyes and you will see some interesting image. Tell me about it. That doesn't sound too hard, and it's not too hard. So there's a continuum from looking on the psychic screen to going to a distant place where you bring with you your emotionality, your sensitivity, your sexuality, whatever you're comfortable with. We can do that with an experienced viewer, but we don't want to scare a newcomer. But there is a continuum, and Bob Monroe understood that. In fact, he wrote about sex on the astral plane in his journeys out of the body. That's how he met his wife. And there are many other. McKinley Cantor wrote a book called Don't Touch Me, where he wrote about interacting with his wife, who was in Los Angeles when he was in service in Japan. And I knew McKinley Cantor had a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Andersonville, and I knew him and his wife because my father published Andersonville. And Cantor said, yes, I could visit my wife, but she didn't like it because I would frequently show up when she was on the freeway because it was 12 hours difference when I was in Japan. So there's a lot of that going on. Aleister Crowley is famous for sex, drugs, and ESP. In his confessions, he talks about all of his multitudinous out-of-body experiences. So this is not a unique thing. People who are interested in out-of-body experiences, but that's outside our program today, right?
Yes.
So here's Bob Monroe, friend of the program. Here's Pat Price, the psychic policeman, playing with my ESP teaching machine. And there I am in the corner, waiting to see what Monroe has to say.
So Pat Price would use his psychic ability in his police work to help him solve murders and different cases like that?
That's exactly right. He came to us with a scrapbook of how he had solved many cases. He would sit in the station house, and if a crime was committed, he would visualize where the scared perpetrator was and dispatch a squad car to pick up the criminal. So he had a whole scrapbook of that kind of thing. So here is our #1 remote viewing. This is the first remote viewing, and many pictures that I'll show you were of this format. Pat and I are sitting in our electrically shielded room, and Hal, my colleague, together with Kit Green, would go to the laboratory office, have the secretary use a random number generator, choose one of 60 possible locations, and I didn't know even what the locations were. So I'm sitting with Pat in the shielded room. Hal and Kit went someplace, and I would sit with Pat and chat with him and say, okay, it's 3 o'clock now. Hal and Kit are at their location. What do you see? He said, you know, I never did this before. I don't see a damn thing. I thought, oh, that's a terrible way to begin this program. And the contract monitor is there. So I said, okay, Pat, you know, Hal is driving his green Honda Accord. Why don't you just follow the Accord out of the parking lot and see where they go? This is the part, an interviewer is an integral part of remote viewing. Remote viewing is a non-analytical ability. You're simply seeing pictures in your mind, and to the extent that you ask questions about them, you're gonna derail yourself. So my job is to be the analytic side. Your brain has two parts, an analytic part and a non-analytic part. The non-analytic part does ESP. The analytic part creates false images corresponding to your judgment. So my prodigious viewer says, I don't see a damn thing. So it's up to me, what can I do to save this experiment? I don't know where they went, so that's not my job. So I said, well, why don't you follow the car? And he said, oh yeah, I see them pulling out. They're going south on Middlefield Road. I see them turning into a park. They're at what looks like a water purification plant. I see a round body of water about 100 feet in diameter. The rectangular body of water about 60 feet by 80. and there's 2 giant water tanks. That's what I see, water purification plant. So I said, that's terrific. And he made the nice drawing on the right. So Hal and Kit Green came back, and we all went back to Rinconada Park, which was the target. And everybody was very excited that he had given the dimensions of the 2 bodies of water within a couple of feet. They were basically 100-foot square, 100-foot round and 60 by 80, and that's what he said. But of course, this is a swimming pool complex. There's no water tower there. So our explanation was he saw the site and decided it was a water purification plant because he'd always been involved in city planning and so forth, and just made that up. But it was a great drawing, highly, highly accurate. Everybody was very happy. And that's the story I told for about a decade, until about 1990, when Palo Alto celebrated its centenary anniversary, and we were all sent picture books. All of us living in Palo Alto were sent picture books of what the city looked like 100 feet ago, 100 years ago. And I'm sure your ESP tells you the answer. 100 years ago, Rinconada Park was a water purification plant, and their book showed those 2 water towers. They're, I don't know whether, boy, you're not going to see my screen anyway, so I don't have to point to things. So there are 2 large water towers that the city sent to us. They're 75 feet tall, and they would undoubtedly have been the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto. So it's no doubt Price had no trouble seeing those. So he put those water towers at the top right of his drawing, just where they had been in the earlier incarnation as a water purification plant. So this gives you an idea that you have to make sure the person describes the target where the beacon people are standing and describe it as it is right now. And we did 9 trials like this with Price, and each couple of days we would do a remote viewing trial and he would describe it. And after 9 trials, we had them match. That is, we would have the drawings that Price made together with his narrative compared with what the actual target looked like. And a perceptual psychologist had the job of looking at the 9 drawings and going to the 9 targets and matching them 1-to-1 as best they could. And he was able to match 7 out of those 9 in first place. So what that means, if Hal had been kidnapped 9 days in a row, carried off by the terrorists, Price would have found him the first place he looked in 7 out of the 9 trials. And everyone recognized that was a highly amazing result. In fact, we published that in Nature magazine, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And even Nature could accept remote viewing with that kind of data. That nobody had ever seen this kind of accuracy. And the reason is we were asking people to do a task which is doable. Hitherto, or previously, things had been centered around card guessing. I've got a circle, a square, wavy lines, a cross, or something else. Can you tell me which one I have? And the answer is, you have a perfect mental memory of those 5 cards now, and it's very hard for you to separate your diaphanous image from the true card that's in the envelope. It's hard to separate the image from your memory. You've got a perfect memory of those things. Think of it as clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. I've got a card in my hand. Is it a club, a spade, or heart, or diamond? Well, first thing's going to pop in your mind, the ace of spades, because that's the way we're conditioned. So if you know the target pool, it makes it impossibly difficult, almost impossible to do that. So people have tried to replicate our work and thought it would be cool. Why don't we show the viewer all the possible targets in advance? And that's a way of extinguishing the ESP because you create so much noise. So from a scientific point of view, we've become very skillful at reducing the noise by using real outdoor targets. Nobody knows what they are, so there's no noise in the system. All I tell you is that hell has gone to an interesting place. I have no idea what it is. Tell me about the images that pop into mind. And you're doing that against a clear slate with no noise. And that was successful. That worked for a decade. And in this particular case, he got 7 out of 9 first place matches. The odds against that are 1 in 100,000, and Nature was happy to publish it. But the CIA said, well, the psychic hide and go seek is good for Nature magazine. We have problems we want to solve. We have actual targets that we'd like to get information about. And we will bring you the geographical coordinates of something, and we want Price to go there and tell us what's going on. And they did that. We went up to it. I should tell you, the reason we're in a shielded room, you may wonder, is that in the beginning, I worked with Uri Geller. And Geller is quite a psychic fellow for doing mind reading and clairvoyance. He did not bend anything at SRI, but he's pretty psychic. And his mentor, Andrea Puharich, is highly intelligent physician, engineer. And we were afraid that Andrea had invented a hearing aid, which puts a signal directly into your 8th nerve through glasses or through a tooth, perhaps. And we were worried that Andrea or one of Uri's friends might send him the answer. It's the radio in the tooth hypothesis. So we used the shielded room to separate Uri Geller from anybody who would send him a radio message. And it turned out that viewers liked being in the shielded room.
Now, what is the shielded room?
Shielded room is like a telephone booth covered with copper screening.
Ah.
And it was very highly shielded. It was part of other equipment at SRI. So in this case, Ken Kress, with our contract monitor, he was undercover, so it's only very recently that I can even dare to say his name. He gave me a slip of paper with coordinates on it, just numbers, didn't mean a thing. X, Y, 1, 2, 3, 4 north, 7, 8, 12 east, that's it. So I read those to Price when we were in our little room, and he said, well, that's very interesting, Russ. I feel like I'm lying on a building, on top of a building, and there's a giant crane is rolling back and forth over my body. There's a huge crane, the 8-wheel crane, 4-wheeled on either side of the building. I better draw a picture of that. And in my illustrations, on the bottom right, you have Price's drawing of the crane, and on the left, you have an enlargement of the crane as shown in the illustration at the top. So Pat Price basically nailed the crane. He drew the thing as well as you could draw it if you were looking right at it. And they were extremely excited about that because, as you see, this is a secret photograph that is, it's now, of course, downgraded. We've got the program declassified. But at the time, this was a secret satellite picture that no one could have seen. So this was as secret as it could be. And Price had no problem drawing that. And CIA was very excited, a little worried about it, a little concerned about this guy who can see anything in the world. And the CIA is very obsessed with secrecy. Is well, that's okay, but of course we knew that this was there. So you might have just been reading our mind.
Well, it's interesting that he was seeing it from the perspective of the rail. As he said, it's rolling back and forth over him.
That's right. That's where it came. He enjoyed lying in the sun, and he was right there with the crane. So they said, well, we want to give you another target that we don't know anything about. And we want to know, what are they doing in the building? So the next day we went back to our shielded room, and Price said, there are a whole group of men in white coats, and they're assembling a huge sphere. They're building a 60-foot sphere out of gores. And a gore is like an orange peel slice. And they're welding these steel gores together, 60 feet in diameter. They're having a hard time because the gores are so thick that they're having a hard time welding them. And this is from Semi-Pelotins that Price was describing the 60-foot gores, and he described these in 1974. We never got feedback from these until 1977, when it was published in Aviation Week from declassified satellite pictures. So here's what the gore looks like based on the airborne pictures. And the important thing to notice here is that this was not published until 77, and Pat Price died in 1975. So this is a case, you might often think, well, Price just looked in the future to see what the feedback looked like. He didn't get any feedback because nobody got to see this thing until 2 years after his death. One of the striking things, of course, is he didn't say they're making a sphere, but he was able to say specifically that it's made out of gores, as the Aviation Week picture shows. So the result of that is that the CIA said, this guy is so psychic, we don't want him hanging out with the hippies in California. We're going to bring him back to Washington, because we have somebody here who can read the launch codes for the missiles in the president's office. We want him to be working with us. So he went to Virginia to work with the CIA. And 5 months after arriving in West Virginia, Pat died mysteriously. And we don't know how that occurred.
Have you thought about remote viewing his desk to see what happened?
That's a very good idea. We haven't done that. No autopsy was done. CIA sort of spirited his body away. I saw him in a memorial, so his body was intact and he was buried, but no autopsy was done, and we don't know his cause of death. But it's pretty mysterious. Because we know the CIA was worried about his prodigious ability. If you got somebody sitting in a cabin who can read anything on your desk, and you work for the CIA, that's a pretty scary proposition.
Yes.
So just before Price left, my colleague, Hal Putoff, went on vacation. He had a free trip to South America. They flew him down to Colombia. And each day, Price was supposed to describe where Hal was on that day. This is more remote viewing. Pat Price and I are, it's like Bobbsey twins. We're back in the shielded room. Hal has gone someplace, and one day Price would say, it looks like a cathedral. And he knew, we know that he's gone to South America. So he says South American kind of thing. There's a cathedral, I see a market, I see a harbor, I see a volcano. And on day 5, Price didn't show up. So I'm in my little shielded room, a tape recorder. This is Russ Targ and Pat Price. This is trial number 5. And it seems like Pat is not going to come today. So I better do it, because it's an important series. We don't want a hole in the series. So I just closed my eyes and said, it looks to me like he's at some kind of island airport. I see ocean at the end of the runway. There's sand and grass on the right and a airport building on the left. And that's what I get. So I made the drawing on the bottom here, and Hal came back with the photograph at the top. And we thought that was a remarkably sharp drawing. And the really good news about this is it shows that remote viewing is so easy that even a scientist can do it.
Maybe you're more psychic than scientist.
That's right. You never know. But as we went on, this is 1974, so things are getting easier and easier. So I finally was freed up. I was then on a journey across the country, and one of the places I stopped was New Orleans, and I bought a picture book of the city of New Orleans, tossed a die on the street to choose a target, and that die led me to the New Orleans Superdome. The viewer here was Gary Langford, who was an SRI physicist, used to be at Lockheed, so he's a straight up physicist as I was. And the interviewer was Elizabeth Rauscher, who's my partner in trying to create a physics model to explain ESP. So Elizabeth was sold on psychic abilities, highly intelligent theoretical physics professor. Gary's an engineer in the box.
Now, was Gary, would you call him a skeptic, or was he open?
No, he's a lifetime psychic, but never did anything like this. He said he used to play baseball, and he was a valuable fielder because he always knew where the ball was going to be hit. So he was a demon outfielder, is what his credentials were. When he said he wants to do something with us, I said, well, what have you done? He said, well, I was a demon outfielder. And we knew him. He's a very amiable guy. We just didn't know that he was psychic. So he's in the shielded room. Elizabeth Rauscher is outside saying, well, it's 3 o'clock now. Russ is at his site. What do you see? Can you make a drawing? He said, well, look, I see the damn UFO in the middle of the city. Do you think he's been abducted?
Yeah.
And Elizabeth said, well, we don't know. It's always possible. Why don't you just draw what you see? And he said, okay, I'll draw this like a UFO on stilts. And then he made another drawing, which we show on the left, which turned out to be the parking lot of the Superdome, where you see all the entrances to the building on the left and the big dome on the right. And his two drawings very nicely match the two photographs that I brought back. And this is the first ever remote viewing for Gary, and he followed me as I went to New York and made a very nice drawing of Grant's tomb, nice drawing of the fountain in Washington Square Park. So he was quite a successful remote viewer with us as a walk-in.
You can adjust your viewing from any angle. You can see the target from above, or then you can change your consciousness to see it from the side. Is that accurate?
You can do that if an interviewer asks you to do it. Generally, a person comes in and sees what he sees. I can say, as a viewer, I'm happy to get an image of anything. So if I get an image of something, I will draw that and like, I got the picture, don't move the camera. But indeed, as you'll see in a minute, I was able to help somebody walk down a hallway and do all sorts of things. And here's Ingo Swann, who's really the father of remote viewing, together with Hella Hamid, who's a professional photographer, charming woman, highly intelligent, friend of the program, and had been my friend for a couple of decades. And we brought Hella into the program when the CIA wanted to see what would an inexperienced person do. We need an ordinary person who's never done this before. Now, it'd be a mistake to say that Hella was an ordinary person, but she had never done this before. And Ingo is the one who told us that you mustn't do card guessing. It's a trivialization of my ability. And he pointed out that the bicameral nature of the brain, half of it's analytical, half of it's pictorial. You want the viewer to deal only in the pictorial side and have the interviewer deal with the analytical side. And it's a two-person job. And he understood that the noise was due to memory, imagination, analysis, grasping, naming, are all sources. Don't try and name it. just tell me what you're experiencing. So Ingo totally understood that from his lifetime as a psychic practitioner.
Fascinating. Now, you brought in Hella Hammond because you thought she would be a good control subject?
Hella was brought in. Hella's our inexperienced viewer, a newbie to the program. So we went up to a comfy room where she could lie down on the couch. And she said, okay, Russ, what do I do? She's the first person that I interviewed where they had no idea what it was. And I just told her my shibboleth about quieting her mind, tell me about the pictures that appear. And she said, something's moving very fast. And that's drawn in the top illustration where she has the arrows. And I said, okay, let's take a break. Well, I knew that I'm always thinking ahead because I know that by and by a judge is going to have to separate out whatever she has on paper from 9 other targets, and her little arrow there won't do the trick. So I said, okay, let's take a break, a few minutes. Let's look again. Hal is still at his place. Does anything new come into view? And she said, it's very interesting. He's at a place that's sort of open and there are holes in it. So it's like a trough in the air, but it's full of holes, so it wouldn't carry water. And that's her second picture. And I said, that's very interesting, Helen. Those are good pictures. But you kind of wrap it up. Can you give me an overall picture of what this looks like? Thinking a judge is going to have to separate this. So she made this squares within squares illustration at the bottom. And I knew that we were done. I said, that's terrific, Helen. Thank you very much. Let's get some coffee. And Hal came back, and he had been at this pedestrian overpass, which greatly resembles what Hella had drawn. So you begin to get the idea. Here we are, and I see there's no date is on my picture, the 1976. So we're now 4 years into the program. We're getting the idea that this kind of prodigious psychic ability may be much more distributed than we ever thought. In fact, we did 9 trials with Hella, and she had 5 first-place matches, 4 second-place matches, and her overall score was 10 times greater than the most psychic man in the world. So Hella's overall score was significant at 1 in a million. And we published her findings in the proceedings of the Institute of Electrical Engineers out of 1 in a million. Now I can tell you off to the side, when we first presented these data, Pat Price and Hella Hammond's amazing drawings as published objects, we took those to a society, Parapsychological Association has an annual meeting, and Hal and I showed 9 pictures from Price and 9 pictures from Hella. People thought we were lying because those were so superior to anything that other people were seeing. Professional parapsychologists essentially said, who are these 2 physicists who just walked into parapsychology research, don't know anything about psychology, and they're doing 9 trials and have odds of 1 in a million, where we have to do 1,000 trials and we're lucky if it's significant at all. So they thought we were lying, or some of them did. Some of them we knew. This is like too good to be true. So at the end of my career and Hella's career, 1981, Ken Kress came into our office. Hella and I were chatting, and he said, I have one more thing I'd like you to do. Can you take a look at Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin? So the target today is Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin. Neither of you have been there, right? And we laughed, of course. It's the last place we've ever been. So he said, okay, well, see what you can do. So Helen and I just went up to our comfy remote viewing room. She lay down on the couch and said, well, I'm walking down a long hall, and at the end of the hall, There's some red doors covered with leather. The red is held in place by upholstery tacks. It is very luxurious, ostentatious doorway that I see. And I say, well, can you see what's going on inside? And she says, no, the door's closed. I said, okay, I'll open the door. And I pulled the door open psychically. And she said, well, I can see the door is open, but it's dark. I said, all right, I'll turn on the lights. Is it like a lucid dream?
Yes.
So I opened the door, turned on the lights, and she said, okay, I see what's going on now. There's an enormous wooden desk on the right, covered with glass. And on the left side, the window open to Red Square, and I can see the big church with the onion dome on the side. So we got Red Square on the left, the big door on the right. And by the way, there's some doors in the plywood behind his desk. And I said, oh, good. Why don't we open the door and see what we get? And she said, there's stairs going down. I said, okay, we can go down the stairs. And she said, well, on the right, there's a big bank of computers. The bank of computers go all the way down sort of a hallway off to the right side. And at that point, I began to feel a little frightened. I have a lot of clearances. I have top secret clearance, but I have no clearance to be in the computer room in the Kremlin.
Did you feel like someone had detected your presence, perhaps, and was trying to track you?
Either someone detected my presence or it was paranoia. I felt very exposed. I felt like my consciousness was down there in the Kremlin, and we know that the Russians are interested in psychic stuff. So I just felt that Helen and I were very exposed in the bowels of the Kremlin. I said, well, I think that's a terrific description. Why don't we get out of here? And we terminated the experiment. And I left SRI because I wasn't able to publish any of the work that we were doing once we started working with Army volunteers. And I was invited 2 years later to give a lecture for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which I did. And that turned out to be in the big ballroom of the Kremlin. And everyone was very excited and a little alarmed where I told them, and what this shows is that there is nothing secret anymore, no more secrets. And to say that in the Kremlin at the height of the Cold War caused a lot of teacups to be shaken. In Russian lectures, everybody's got a cup of tea. So you just hear all the teacups rattling when I said there are no secrets anymore. They said, by the way, is there anything you'd like to see in the Kremlin? And I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I'd like to see Brezhnev's office. I don't need to meet the prime minister, but I'd sure like to see where he sits. And they took me down the hallway, and the red doors were just the way I show here, just as Hella drew them. And we went inside, the desk is on the right, and the window overlooking Red Square is on the left. So that was really shocking for me to see right after Hella had described that. And I do not recall now if there's doors behind the desk, but I probably wouldn't have asked to open them anyway.
Yeah.
The red doors held in place by the upholstery tacks were the high point in me. It was shocking when I walked down the corridor and saw those, just as Hella drew them.
Now, did you tell them that Hella had seen this 2 years ago?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Now, this is an illustration that goes with what I see. You got to remember that Hella is our control person. Hella's the inexperienced control who brought in. We want to see what does an ordinary person do. So it really gives you quite an eye-opening view of what an ordinary person can do. In the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that my NASA contractor came to my office and met with Ingo Swann and me and said, we're about to launch Pioneer 2 spacecraft to Jupiter. Is there anything interesting that we're going to find? So Ingo took out his pen and paper and made this drawing. He did this on one sheet of paper as though this is really a formal remote viewing. He put his name and his date on the top, made a number of drawings, and you can see in the middle, he clearly draws the planet with a ring around it. And 8 months later, NASA came back and had the first ever description of ice crystals around Jupiter. So Ingo was able to look out 500 million miles and be the first person in the world to ever confidently say that they're the ring around Jupiter. So the Army intelligence, INSCOM, the intelligence command, would frequently send somebody out to SRI to do a task, find a downed airplane, for example. The opening scene in our movie, Third Eye Spies, we have Jimmy Carter describing how the CIA asked us to find a downed Russian airplane in northern Africa because the satellites couldn't find it in the jungle. And one of our viewers was able to quiet his mind, mark a map, draw a circle, say it's the river, there's the mountains, between the river and the village, you're gonna find the airplane coming out of the river. And the CIA sent a helicopter into Zaire, no permission, just flew in, and next to the river, they found the airplane, full of code books. The point of my story is that the Army was tired of sending people to California. Like, I hate to send people out to the Oracle if I want to do something. Can't we do this ourselves? So we had a task to train some Army officers to become psychic. So Hal and I went to Fort Meade and had a chance to interview quite a large number. There are 30 Army officers, of whom we chose 6 to come and do remote viewing with us. These were all people who said, yes, they thought that they could do this, it made sense to them. They're willing to mortgage your career and come to California. First person I worked with was Joe McMoneagle, a senior warrant officer. So we sat at a table in our workroom, and I said, your major has gone to hide someplace with Hal. I have no idea where they are. What do you see? What comes to mind? And he made a whole bunch of little drawings around the edge of the page. And I said, well, those are interesting drawings, but I think a judge is going to have a hard time with those. Could you consolidate those pictures? He said, yeah, I think they're at a building that's very tall in front, like piano keys in front, and a long building behind, and a fountain in the corner. And he made the drawing that show in the lower figure. And his major and Hal went to hide at the Palo Alto Art Museum. And this looked like a auspicious beginning for Joe. Very, very successful drawing. And 9 years later, our program was closed up. Ed May, who's another physicist, took over the program, moved to SAIC in Menlo Park, but continued the remote viewing program working with Joe. The CIA agent visited him and said, I haven't been to see you for some time. I have an idea for an experiment to do. It's 8 o'clock now. I'm gonna go drive someplace, and I'll be someplace at 10, and then I'll be at someplace at 12. So I'd like you to make a drawing of where I am at 10 and where I am at 12. And at 10 o'clock, he was at the Altamont windmill farm and made the drawings that I showed down below. He said there's some hills and there's something up on posts. There's something rotating on the posts that's part of a grid. And he made this very nice drawing 100 miles away. The next place he went to is Lawrence Livermore our own atomic bomb factory. And I'm noting here to remind me that in our experiments, we did not have displacement. We did not have a decline effect. In all the card guessing experiments, even though people can start very good, they get worse and worse as they go along. It doesn't wipe out the effect, but it's very disappointing for people like J.B. Rhine to have this stellar card guessing person and they all get worse. My purpose in showing this slide is you can see Joe's drawing of the building in the lower left. He said, I see a 6-story building shaped like a letter T covered with glass. And that's what he drew. In the upper left, you see the 6-story building covered with glass. So there's no decline. It's very important that our people don't name the wrong target, which is called displacement, and they don't get worse. In fact, they get more discerning. They become increasingly able to tell the psychic signal from the mental noise. And I do also, as an interviewer, I can hear somebody say something in a tone of voice that just doesn't sound like ESP. I once did an experiment described briefly with somebody who's sure that they can do that. And they say, well, okay, I'm ready. It looks like Macy's. And I said, please don't tell me about Macy's. Let's start over. That doesn't sound like remote viewing. That sounds like a guess. Just tell me what you're experiencing. What are you experiencing that makes you say Macy's? He said, well, I see a bunch of hangers all in a row. And he went on to make a drawing of the pedestrian overpass. If there weren't an interviewer working with him, he would be anchored to Macy's and it would just be a big fat miss. But at that point, I was quite experienced, and Macy's doesn't sound like a remote viewing. Macy's sounds like a guess. Mm-hmm. So although I didn't know what the target was at all, no idea, but I knew that what he said didn't make sense. So we worked with these 6 Army officers, and we did 6 trials with each one. And you would expect to get 6 first-place matches. You'd expect each of them to get 1 first-place match in his set. Each of the 6 did 6 trials. You, by randomness, you'd expect one of those 6 to be first place. So you expect to get 6 first-place matches. We got 19 first-place matches, which is, again, a score of 1 in a million for these people. All the good scores were with 4 of them. 2 of them sort of never figured it out. But the 4 who did well did very well, getting 6 out of 6 or 5 out of 6, did remarkably well. So my 6 random people, 6 inexperienced people from the floor of the gymnasium, 6 trials from 6 people gave a score of 1 in a million. And this, in fact, is the drawing I wanted to publish, and the Army wouldn't let me publish anything. And at that point, I left SRI. In this little dissertation, I have not left out a bunch of misses. In this experiment with the 6 people, 2 of them couldn't do it. 4 of them did extremely well. So in this experiment that I show in the chart, you see all the data we have significant at 1 in a million.
And at the end of the program, Joe drew this cartoon showing your socks being blown off by the great results.
So I left SRI and wanted to put this to some good use, and I created a company called Delphi Associates. And Delphi, of course, is the oracle, all-knowing oracle in Greece. So I named the company Delphi Associates. And we did remote viewing to forecast changes in the silver commodity market. And each day, each week, once a week, we wanted to forecast whether the silver would go up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot. And my psychic I was working with, very experienced psychic, then I would sit at my kitchen table and say, well, the broker John in Marin has got some objects, and I'm going to show you one next Friday. Here we are on Monday. I'd like you to please tell me about the object I'm going to put in your hand next Friday. So I didn't say, do you think silver is going to go up? And I kept ourselves ignorant of what the market was going to do. So we did 9 of these guessing games each week. What am I going to put in your hand? 1 of 4 objects. And all 9 forecasts were correct. 9 out of 9, he was able to describe which of the 4 objects. And of course, each week there are different objects. It's like the broker would decide, well, today I'm going to choose my coffee cup, a leftover pancake, a flower, and a book. And I would say, my psychic I was working with, what do you see? He said, well, it's a round object, has a funny smell, and is kind of floppy. I would say, but that's a great description. So I call the broker and say, what have you got, John? He said, well, I've got a coffee cup, a flower, a book, and my leftover pancake from breakfast. And I said, it's a leftover pancake. What does that mean? He said, let me look. He said, oh, that means down a lot. I said, okay, that means we sell silver. So that happened, we were selling silver at a time when the Hunt brothers were trying to drive it up. So this success, we made a huge amount of money on this one trial because we successfully went against the market. So we had no sense were we following the market. In fact, we made $120,000 and were written up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And I should mention that the following year, we were not successful for a number of reasons, one of which is the broker wanted to do it twice a week, which meant that the viewer did not get feedback for trial 1 instead of till after we did trial 2, and that was not a good idea. But this definitely worked, and there is now a whole industry of people forecasting sporting events in the market using remote viewing. This is called associative remote viewing and gave birth to a new industry.
Incredible.
But of course, we didn't invent this. This was done initially in Delphi. And I've been to Delphi in the Temple of Athena. The water is still bubbling out of the temple, so you can do your ablutions before you go and see the oracle. And the famous case, what drew me to Delphi, is a famous instance that Herodotus writes up in great detail, where the king of Lydia, King Croesus, was afraid of the Persians and was looking for an oracle. So he sent 7 messengers out to 7 oracles. And when the messenger of Croesus went to the oracle at Delphi, this is like a remote viewing. The messenger shows up, that's like the customer coming to SRI. And the customer doesn't get to talk to the priestess, the customer talks to the priest and says, what do you want to know? So the priest then goes to the oracle and says, I have a question from a customer. Will you quiet your mind and tell me what the answer is? I'm not going to tell you anything about the question. I just want you to tell me what you see. And the oracle says, I can count the words, I can see the ocean. I have ears that hear all that can be heard. Something striketh my nose, the smell of a shell-covered tortoise boiling in a fire together with the flesh of a lamb is brass above and brass below. So basically the oracle says, I smell somebody's making lamb and tortoise stew in a brass pot, brass above, brass below. So the 7 messengers went back to Croesus, and the messenger from Oracle had this story about Croesus in his courtyard, cutting up a lamb and a tortoise, and that's exactly what he was doing. The king was in his courtyard, cutting up the animals, throwing them in a brass pot and boiling them. And he was so excited, King Croesus caused 117 gold bricks to be cast, gold bars, and sent them to the Oracle at Delphi together with a gold lion to stand on them. And Herodotus was there to see the bars and the lion and wrote this narrative 250 BC. I don't have firsthand drawings, but Herodotus is taken as a good witness. And since it's in such detail, scholars of that period think that this really occurred. William Parks wrote as a Oxford scholar of the oracles, and he wrote the narrative that I saw, and he sent me to Herodotus. So I think this probably occurred. So we didn't invent remote viewing. This is an early double-blind experiment because the viewer and the messenger, nobody knew what the answer was until you got back to Croesus. Now, an early writer on this subject is Padmasambhava, the great Buddhist guru, and he wrote a book very much like other books written by contemporary ESP researchers. He wrote a book called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. That sounds a lot like what we're talking about. And he wrote this 800 AD. And he said that your nature is timeless awareness. You're not limited by space and time. In fact, you're not limited by cause and effect, because your consciousness is outside of time. Therefore, time and effect, cause and effect, don't affect you. So it's really quite amazing that somebody in the 8th century is saying, your consciousness is outside of time, therefore you're free of cause and effect. So a very remarkable observation. And he said, as you're looking for timeless awareness or naked awareness, the main thing is to give up your desire to name and to grasp the things that you're seeing. You want to be free of naming and grasping. Naming and grasping are the enemy of timeless awareness, which is exactly what I'm telling people 1,200 years later. So again, the idea here is that remote viewing is not new age. The Greeks understood it. The Buddhists understood it at the time of Christ, and that's what we're pursuing now. And I encourage you to pursue this. And my last accomplishment is I produced this film called Third Eye Spies, which is a unique event in that we show the illustration that I show here, and we have our 2 CIA contract monitors, Kit Green and Ken Kress, are on camera saying, yes, the stuff Russ described actually happened, and it was even useful for the CIA. So that makes us and this is streaming at no cost to people who have Amazon Prime.
Well, our time is running out for today. I just want to thank you for coming on the show, Russell. It's been fascinating hearing you talk about your experiences. You've had just such an interesting life and worked with some amazing people and talents. I want to thank you for sharing your work with us today. I hope you'll come back maybe another time and we'll do another show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to have the opportunity. What it shows is that if you live long enough, you get to do a lot of interesting things. I'm very happy to have done this with you.
Well, thank you so much. You have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Well, thank you.
So is that perfectly clear to everybody?
I think that was perfectly clear. We've got a lot of good questions coming in, and both from YouTube and here. So let me see if I can I'm going to oh, have you used remote viewing to contact aliens?
I have not contacted aliens. Pat Price at SRI was very interested in doing that. he identifies some potential UFO bases, one in Alaska, one in the Pyrenees, one in Australia. And the CIA was very interested in very interested in Pat Price's UFO base in Australia, but I have not had any, I've had no experiences with aliens. I did once visit a UFO, but that's another story.
Someone wants to know, how can we learn remote viewing?
There are a lot of people on the internet who will teach you remote viewing, and remote viewing is so easy to do that my feeling is that anybody who offers to teach you can probably do it. Another way to answer that is last book I wrote called The Reality of ESP has a chapter describing how to learn remote viewing working with a partner. So in this chapter, I tell you to find a friend. I don't tell you how to find a friend, but if you're able to find a friend, you really need a part. It's a two-person game. So your friend will bring objects to your house in a shopping bag and then guide you to describe the object. And eventually you'll be describing objects that are not known by your friend. Because you don't want to teach yourself to read the mind of your partner. So in one chapter of my book, Reality of ESP, I tell you how to learn to do this thing, which is really not very hard, so it doesn't involve very many pages.
Ruth, I think, says there's a Robert Monroe introductory gateway course that's taught through DVD. And I think people are putting in the chat, actually, other resources as well.
Bob Monroe, the organization, Bob Monroe died a few years ago, so he's no longer there. Skip Atwater is an experienced remote viewer from my program. Joe McMonagle is also there. Everybody's getting older, so I don't know if these people themselves are still teaching, but the organization, the Monroe Institute, was set up to teach people how to have out-of-body experiences and how to do remote viewing, and they're in Virginia, called the Monroe Institute.
So
and I should say, Monroe Institute is a nice place to be, and by and large, everybody I've met there has been quite ethical and friendly, and they won't steal your money.
Good. Okay. So a couple people are asking for your UFO story. Are you willing to tell it?
Well, I had been talking to Ingo a lot about UFOs, and Pat Price was also an enthusiastic UFO watcher. So one day at night, I was in bed. I just thought I would have a out-of-body experience, which is something I already knew how to do. And I thought I would just go look for UFO. And I went straight into the stratosphere. Oh, I know. Carl Jung described this also. He had an out-of-body experience that he describes in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I think that's where I got my model for what to do. Jung just describes he went straight out of his body into the starry skies. He did not find a UFO, incidentally, but the protocol of going out of your body into the starry universe is something that appealed to me, and I thought I could do that. And I ran into this very enormous UFO. Now, the reason I tell the story is that we're always very concerned with what we call analytical overlay. So if I left my body and found a little silver UFO floating around in the neighborhood, I would think that's just something from memory and imagination. I've seen tons of pictures of little silver UFOs, as all of you have. What I ran into here is something that, in my experience, was something very enormous. with a UFO the size of a 747. And I sort of passed inside of that, looked around. I was going down a corridor, and on the right side of the corridor, there were a whole bunch of beds. There were people, as far as I could make out, lying on the beds, and they were each under hair dryers. So I walked down to the end of that corridor, and there was a metal door. And again, my paranoia got the better of me. I'm sort of out here in space on a UFO. Truly anything could happen to me. So I thought I would just return to Earth at that point. And the next day I told, which I did, next day I told Pat Price about that. He said, "Oh, that's very interesting. You found the body storage area. You're lucky you got out of that, because you could have fallen into what the Scientologists call a theta trap, where they grab your consciousness. You'd have simply been a prisoner on the spacecraft and your body would have died. So you're lucky you left."
Wow. There was a question that came in from YouTube that wanted to know about Scientology and how it was related to the program at SRI. There were people involved in Scientology, or was there any connection?
Well, that's a two-part question. Yes, Hal Puthoff, Ingo Swann, and Pat Price were all enthusiastic Scientologists at the time. Hella Hammett and I were not Scientologists, and neither was Keith Harari. Basically, the Jews in the program were not Scientologists. The Christians were all Scientologists. And it's because Jewish people tend to be very allergic to dogma. It's very hard to get Jews to swallow your dogma. So Ingo, Keith was a prodigious psychic. He's the one who did the silver forecasting, 9 out of 9 correct, that brought us to the Wall Street Journal. But the Scientology organization had nothing to do with us. And Ingo and Hal left Scientology midway through the program. Pat Price was captured by the CIA and moved to Virginia. And while in the middle of the program, 1975, Pat Price was working with the CIA, living in a farmhouse in Virginia. And we now know that each day after Price would do a psychic spying adventure with Ken Kress, he would then communicate, Pat Price would then communicate with his Scientology auditor, which is like your confessor in church. And he would tell the auditor all about the top secret stuff he was doing with the CIA. Now, we know that that happened because 2 years after Price died, the IRS broke into the Scientology Celebrity Center in LA, and they called us, having found a folder full of documents from Pat Price and Ken Kress. There were obviously CIA documents pertaining to some kind of psychic spying, and the FBI called Kress, who was totally shocked that his buddy, workmate, had been each day communicating with his church, as it were, and telling them what he was doing. Now, the mystery is that Pat Price died 6 months after joining Scientology. What we do not know is when the CIA discovered that Price was a double agent. So CIA had a problem potentially that they were working with the most psychic person in the world who could read documents on your desk, penetrate the Libyan embassy, see anything in the world and read it. And he was working for the Scientology. So what do you do when you discover that Superman is a double agent? And I don't know the answer to that, but Pat Price died mysteriously 6 months after he left SRI.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that came in. Do you think the CIA killed him?
Well, we knew that Pat Price had a heart condition, as they used to say. Now, I'm 86 years old, and Pat Price was 57. So from my point of view, he's not that old. So he had something the matter with his heart, but we don't know that that killed him.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians also knew about Pat Price, we now know. So as a question, did the CIA kill him because he was a double agent? Did the Russians kill him because he was a psychic spy, or did he die from a heart attack? And I do not know the answer to that. I've now told you everything I know. The mystery in that is that I don't know when the CIA discovered that Price was a double agent. That is, from everything I know, Ken Kress, who was his interviewer and operator, as it were, did not know that Price was a double agent at that time, or he would have quit working with him instantly. So Kress was extremely upset 2 years after Price's death when he learned that Price was working for the Scientologists. It was really a shock. He's still shocked about that betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, Price was an intelligent man, but he was not trained in spycraft. So from my point of view, I would be very surprised if you can put the psychic guy out in the farmland, work with him every day. He has no clearances, but he's doing top secret stuff. I would be surprised if he was not under surveillance during that period. I don't know one way or another that he was. Just from what I know about my decade with the CIA, I would be shocked if they weren't tapping his phone or reading his mail.
Okay, thank you.
So it's a mystery.
It's a mystery. There's a question. Someone wants to know, has anyone, or did you, in anyone that you've worked with, ever remote view an historical event? Something that happened, 2,000 years ago, or something that happened, in the 1700s?
No, I have not done that. The great expert in that is Stephen Schwartz. He
Mhm.
wrote a book called Psychic Archaeology, which described exactly his life's work doing psychic archaeology with very talented people.
And apparently he trains people as well still. Someone wrote in the chat.
I don't think so. Oh yeah, I beg your. Indeed, he does. He has workshops. He does. I said no because in his psychic archaeology he worked with experienced people, but he also does workshops. So if you go to his website, well, I don't know. He probably has a website. If you just look up
I'm
Stephen
sure.
Schwartz, he's all over the internet. He also has a daily newspaper that he publishes called the Schwartz Report. And that at the bottom of that, it tells what he's doing currently or the next thing. So if you look up Schwartz Report, you'll find the day's news, principally in medical things and environmental things. And it also tells you the books he's written and the workshops that he's conducting. So the two people I know, Stephen Schwartz and Paul Paul H. Smith, who lives in Utah. Smith was one of the leaders of the Stargate program conducted the Army Psychic Corps. So Paul Smith is a very experienced remote viewing teacher, and I know many people who've worked with him.
And someone mentioned Lynn Buchanan and Major Ed Dames. Are you familiar with Major Ed Dames?
I would not work with Ed Dames. See, Ed Dames is sort of a loose cannon in my view, that he learned remote viewing at the Army program, and he was frequently on coast-to-coast radio forecasting things that are going on, and he was always incorrect. He was on and on and on, giving detailed descriptions of things that never happened. So I would probably not go with Ed Danes.
Okay.
Lynn Buchanan has been teaching for a long time. I sort of don't know exactly what he's doing, but he's in business teaching remote viewing. I'm quite familiar with, I've taught with Schwartz many, many times at Omega. We've done many workshops together. So I have total confidence in Stephen Schwartz teaching remote viewing. And Paul Smith is also a very, very trustworthy person that I know. I have no problem with Lynn Buchanan. I just don't know what he's doing.
Okay. Margarita says that she thinks the span of psychic and extrasensory research in Russia, in the USSR, was overrated here in the US. She said she's been working in the 80s in Moscow in neurophysiology of behavior, and knew someone in high committees of science and never heard of any such big programs. Would they have talked about such big programs, or do you know if this is just a couple people kind of doing stuff in their off hours, or that this was a quite a large government funded program?
Well, there are two sides to the Russian program. Ed May was very involved after the Cold War with the people who were doing the psychic spying for the Russians. And he said they had a substantial program doing stuff like what we were doing, but it didn't work as well as ours. When I was in Russia in 1983 and 84, I went to Soviet Armenia and visited a psychologist there named Ruben Agazimsan, who had a number of graduate students at the university doing remote viewing. Ruben spoke English, and he went through his notebooks with me, and his data looked just like my data. And he said, one of the problems is that people often describe the target before it's chosen. So people will sit down and start writing the target while he's still off in his office choosing a target and sending somebody there. So by the time he's come back to the room where the person has been sitting, they're done with their drawing and the person has not done that. So their ordinary remote viewing is contaminated with precognition. And I said, yes. In one of Pat Price's formal sessions, we were sitting in our little shielded room, and Price said, why don't I just tell you where they're going, and then we can go and get some coffee. So he gave a very good description of a boat docked, sailboats with their masts up and some with the sails furled. And then there's a restaurant off to the side that looks like a Chinese pagoda. And then we went to get some coffee. And then an hour later, we were back at a place just like what he described. But it had not even been chosen, because that was chosen not from our target pool, but our laboratory director, Bonner Cox, wanted to test our system. So he drove with Hal, just drove randomly and went down to the San Francisco Bay in Redwood City and found this boat dock.
Someone wants to know, in the interview you mentioned, it was they talked about the ESP training machine that you designed. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, that somehow slipped out of the program that had been in the film at one point. I built a 4-choice ESP game I'm about to show you. It looks exactly like this. Not like that. I'm glad I looked at. As it disappears when I put on the camera. Anyway, it's a 4-choice trainer, and this is a free game. If you go to the Apple store, it's called ESP Trainer, and you want to press the button that will ring the bell, show you a picture. And I built this as part of our NASA program to help people learn about ESP. And my story was, if NASA will give me money, I'll build a device that will help astronauts get in touch psychically with the spacecraft. And since von Braun was already in my psychic bubble, because he did very well with this machine, we then went to talk to the administrator, Jim Fletcher, and they agreed to give me $80,000 to build an ESP training machine and test some people and see if they could learn, and they could learn. And there are a lot of people doing this online. I invite people to write to me if they're getting 12 or more, which is twice as many as you would expect by chance. And lots of people learn to do that.
And the app is called ESP Trainer?
Yes. And that's free at the Apple App Store.
Okay, so check that out, you guys. Someone posted, they wanted to know about, I know we're really not talking about out of body experiences, but it sounds like they could be dangerous if your soul can be hijacked. In this theta, what did you call it? Theta field. So like out of body experiences could be dangerous versus remote viewing where you stay rooted in your body. Is there a
Well, you can scare yourself. That is, if you're traveling outside your body and something scary happens, it would be like a nightmare. That you might feel. You could read one of Monroe's books called Journeys Out of the Body, and there are other books earlier than Monroe. Like all these things, nobody invented anything. There were books about out-of-body travel a generation before Bob Monroe. And they were writing about the silver cord in the time of Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society. I can't remember the author who preceded Bob Monroe, but if you look for out of body, you'll find a whole litany of other people and other books. I've never had anybody have a bad experience or frightening experience. The only person that I ever led in a sort of out-of-body experience like that was Hella, who was already a sort of woman of the world, had done remote viewing for several years. And I knew that, and she trusted me, I knew that we would not have a bad experience.
Going back to the games, is there Jacqueline says that Jack Houck had helped develop a remote viewing game. Do you know of any current remote viewing games that are available?
I don't know of any remote viewing games that are available. There is a set of pictures. I don't know what's available. Somebody once made a set of 50 pictures, which they intended to be a game, and I traded them a couple of books to them, and so I could pull it out and show that to you. But the answer is, but that was all 20 years ago. So I don't know. I believe that there are remote viewing games because I, from time to time, look on the internet. Well, I'm not going to do that now. To see that my ESP trainer is still up, and I run into things that are called ESP games. But I don't know if there's a remote viewing game.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions about using remote viewing for predicting the stock market. And does one of your books have a detailed description of how that worked?
Yeah, my last book, The Reality of ESP, has a chapter on how the remote viewing works. It's a 4-choice game, up a little, up a lot, down a little, down a lot. And the reason you use associated remote viewing rather than saying is silver going up or is it going down, is you want to escape memory and imagination and guessing, all of which are the enemy of psychic functioning. You've got to be aware to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise. That's why you use objects. That's why you use associative remote viewing. Stephen Schwartz is the first person to do associative remote viewing in the modern era.
What can we do? This is coming in from YouTube. What can we do to become more clear and accurate, differentiating between mental noise and the clarity of viewing?
Well, partly that's what the interviewer does. The interviewer is really like an interviewer. That is the when you're beginning to learn beginning to learn remote viewing, the interviewer is very, very helpful to help you to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise, because the interviewer is aware of what guessing sounds like as what free associating sounds like. So an interviewer can be quite helpful. And the way to avoid guessing is to be doing a target where you have no idea what the answer could be. For example, if I tell you I'm thinking of a number from 1 to 10, what's my number? That's basically an impossible task, even for a good psychic, because the mental noise is huge. See, if I tell you it's a number from 1 to 10, you have a crystal clear picture of those numbers. So even though your odds are 1 in 10 from getting the right one, it's even hard for an experienced remote viewer to pick the right one because the mental noise is so great. Mental noise is greater than the picture. On the other hand, if I say, I'm visualizing a place, someplace on the planet, which I know pretty well, but I don't think you've ever seen. Tell me about the image that I'm going to show you, or the image that I'm thinking about. That's a much easier task. Like if we would sit right now and I would say, Judy, make a drawing of the thing I'm visualizing, I would expect you to be able to do that. So the surprise there is that it's easier to describe a place chosen from an infinitude of possible places than it is to guess some number from 1 to 10. And that's because by doing it, by telling you in advance, you don't know this place, just quiet your mind and tell me about this surprising image. I've set the stage for you to do something that's pretty easy to do. I've sort of set you up to do a successful thing. Whereas if I tell you I've got a number from 1 to 10, that's very hard to do.
Excellent. That's a good distinction. Jacqueline wants to know if you can speak a moment about the use of drugs or medicines in relation to remote viewing? And were there experiments at SRI that took those factors into consideration?
No, we didn't do any drugs at SRI. We were trying to stay clean and not get in trouble with the management. The fact that we were already doing psychic spying at SRI already had us in trouble with the university. The university got very mad at us that SRI was now working for the CIA. They felt that cast bad light on the university. And in fact, the university separated itself from SRI. SRI used to be Stanford Research Institute. And the year we came, they dropped to Stanford.
Well, interesting.
You asked something else. There was another part of that question.
It was about medicines.
Yeah, everybody would like to know. Everybody would like marijuana to make you psychic, or LSD to make you psychic, and it absolutely does not work because marijuana and LSD creates lots and lots of pictures. And if you're doing remote viewing, you sort of want pictures, but you don't want to be overwhelmed with random pictures. You want to see one picture corresponding to the place you're looking at. So I remember the one time I did that with some brand new, wonderful marijuana to smoke, and it was just instantly clear to me that this is not a good path. You just it's like turning up the volume so loud that you can't hear anything. Now I have had a good experience with MDMA, in which I was able to read several playing cards, suit and number, which is quite a tough thing to do. So on my very first MDMA experience, I had the experience of doing crystal clear remote viewing with 3 playing cards under pretty good conditions.
So that was in your own private life, though. That wasn't through.
That's right.
All right. Okay, so do you think studies in astrology can help develop clairvoyance, like a Nostradamus effect?
No, I think those have nothing to do with each other. I mean, some of the Ingo Swann was interested in astrology as another channel, but I don't think it had anything to do with his. I think he followed the rule book in doing his astrology. Now, I should say that I've been to a couple of pretty good astrologers, and my impression is that they hide behind the astrological chart. That is, they may say you were born under Aries, blah, 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 and I see that you're doing some construction work. You're going to have a problem drilling the holes, but you'll be finished within a week. And my thought was, where does it say that in the astrological chart? So it's clear that the astrologer supplement whatever she's doing with whatever psychic images come her way.
But you don't think that the study of astrology can help facilitate psychic awareness?
I don't have any reason to believe that. I don't know of any case, and it doesn't make, they're quite different kinds of things. The astrology is a straight up analytic task. If you're doing astrology by the chart, then that's an analytic task. Remote viewing wants to be entirely non-analytic.
So here's an interesting question from Deborah. She said she has an aptitude for being a remote viewer interviewer, and she's very interested in becoming a professional RV interviewer. So the question is, how does one go about doing that? Is there training to be an interviewer, and do you mentor people?
Well, it's worse than that. That is, there's no particular training for being an interviewer that I know of, and there's also no particular employment for such a person. That is, since the end of the SRI program, psychic research has significantly dried up. Dean Radin is still doing excellent work at Noetic Sciences, but there's much, much less psychic research happening because there's less money around.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So I think that answers this.
I would have to say I sort of used my ESP to find my job at SRI. I was getting ready to leave Sylvania, where I had built a big laser, which is shown several times in the film. And it's a long, funny story. The short version is I was invited to give a lecture at St. Simon's Island at a NASA conference on speculative technology. And I got there by a whole string of amazing coincidences. But I was on St. Simon's. I met Werner von Braun, and he liked my ESP game because he did very well, and he had a psychic grandmother. So he took me to Jim Fletcher and said, support these guys. So that's for the first money that came in. So people always want to know, well, didn't you have a hard time getting money for your program? And the answer is, as it happened, I had an easy time getting money for my program. I got this promise from von Braun and Fletcher. Edgar Mitchell was there, so I was able to bring Edgar Mitchell to SRI, and he testified to Charlie Anderson, the president of SRI, yes, NASA will support this guy for an ESP program. You should start an ESP program and hire Russell. So that was, it sounds like something psychic was operating there. Because people always say, well, wasn't it hard to get money to start a program? And the answer is no, it was not hard. I just asked the right people at the right time, and all the people I talked to said yes.
Excellent. So I guess that kind of answers the questions. Do you currently work with any psychics today in any way?
No, I'm not doing the. I made this nice film to sort of document my year at SRI, but by and large, I'm not doing that anymore. I do occasional interviews, but I'm not teaching anymore.
Right. Is there a distinction between remote viewing of places versus surprise images related to people you don't know?
What's it for? Oh, spaces?
Places. Remote viewing of places versus surprise images related to people you don't know.
Well, I don't have any experience with doing things about people that I don't know. I just don't know anything about that. My vision is very poor, so I don't really recognize people even when I'm looking at them. I can see them, of course, but I'm not going to recognize them the next time I see them, and they're always very disappointed. Like, how could you not recognize beautiful me? But I have a handicap, so I don't recognize people. So I would not. I've not done anything psychic in that realm.
So I have a couple questions about sort of your view of reality and the nature of reality. First, what is your dream life like? Do you find yourself doing remote viewing in the dream realm, or do you do lucid dreaming?
Well, I have occasional very good remote view, very good precognitive dreams. And the trick of having precognitive dreams is you have to be able to separate dreams that are anxiety dreams or wish fulfillment dreams or dreams from the previous day's residue. You want to separate those non-psychic dreams from dreams that are bizarre and unusually clear. The bizarre and unusually clear dreams are the ones that are precognitive. Now, a good way to start to have precognitive dreams is to write them down, which I never have done. But I understand the idea that if you have a record book by your bedside and each night you write down your dreams, you can learn to separate out the psychic dreams from the anxiety dreams. I have not done that. My rule is that I've learned to do this pretty well now, so that in order to get credit in the big book for actually having a precognitive dream, I have to tell my wife about the dream before it occurs. So I wake up and I have to think about the interesting dream I had. Was that stimulated by something I saw on television last night, which is often the case, or is this a unique dream that has no known provenance? In which case I'll tell my wife, and then I will go to my computer where I see the front page of the New York Times or something else, and I frequently will have a dream based on what's on the front page of the New York Times or some other interesting thing that shows up right in front of me, or in the movies the following night.
So there was a question earlier on about speaking of precognition. What do you see about the transfer of power in our country in January?
Oh, I don't know anything about that. I believe you're asking about what my belief system is. I'm confident that people can learn to see the future. That is, I have no doubt about that, because we've seen that in the laboratory. I have a lot of experience with unusual dreams. I had a dream. I can tell you about a dream. Telling people dreams is like telling them about your last acid trip. It's usually not that. I had a dream about not having enough money to go to Esalen, which is a place that I had taught for 40 years. And I wanted to go to a conference in the big house there where we all sit in a circle. And in the dream, I didn't have enough money to do that because Esalen has now gotten very expensive. And in my 40th year, I said goodbye. I'm done teaching, not because I couldn't afford it, but I just got tired of doing it. If I have a group of people who've all paid a couple of $1,000 for a weekend, I then have a big demand situation where I've got to teach them magic so they're actually able to do that, or they'll be mad at me. So I always promise people that everyone here will either do something psychic or see something psychic. And I can do that. So in my dream, I was not able to go to this meeting at the big house. And the first thing that I saw in the morning was I got an email from somebody who was making a film about Esalen, and they sent me a preview, and that opens up with a picture of everybody sitting happily in the big house, including me, in a circle. And that was the opening. And I had told my wife about this. So within 10 minutes of telling Patricia about my dream about the big house, I had it on my screen in front of me. So that would be an example of a precognition with good feedback. And I have a lot of those.
Have you connected the Schumann resonance frequencies with remote viewing abilities or psychic abilities?
I'm familiar with Schumann resonance, but I haven't done anything with that. I don't know that that has anything to do with remote viewing. In my life experience, remote viewing is quite easy to do. There's two people can sit down And one says, I've got an interesting object in a bag here. Tell me about your impressions of the unusual thing I'm going to put in your hand. And that's so easy to do. In my experience, that generally works the first time if there's trust between the people. But I've done that with many, many government scientists who come to the lab. They want to see, they were thinking of giving you money. Can you show me something psychic? And I say, sure, I can. They say, well, who's the psychic here? And I say, well, you are. And I explain that if I have Ingo Swann do some psychic thing for them, they will then go back to Washington and say, how did they trick me? How did they deceive me? But if I guide him to have a accurate visual impression and draw a picture of where the major is hiding, he'll believe that that really occurred. So for my decade, I showed lots and lots of government scientists right up to the Secretary of Defense, show them how to do remote viewing in my lab.
Okay, so we're gonna, just noting the time, I think we'll go 3 more questions. Here's a pretty straightforward one. Is Uri Geller a fraud, or was he legitimate? Or is he legitimate?
Well, remote viewing and spoon bending is not so hard. Yeah, I'd been to some spoon bending events. My girlfriend at the time rolled up a spoon, and I trusted her, so I thought that was very amazing. So I said, the next time there's a spoon bending event, let's go, and I'll try and do it. So at the spoon bending conference the next month, I live in the Bay Area, so the idea of spoon bending conferences every month is to be expected. So I chose a rod like this one. I'm pretty strong, so I wanted to get something hard to bend. This is a 3/8 inch aluminum rod, and it's short enough so that even a strong person can't bend it that way. So I just sat quietly holding the rod at my fingertips so I wouldn't accidentally bend it. And everybody around was saying, bend, spoon, bend. And I felt it getting kind of soft. I opened my eyes, and this is what I had. And I drew a crowd. So my simple answer is that if I can bend a rod, I have no reason to doubt that Uri Geller can bend a rod, since he's been spending his life doing it.
Okay. So Mark Ireland is watching, and I know you know him. He's a friend of FMBR, and he's spoken here a couple of times. When he spoke, you asked him about his father, who was Richard Ireland, the famous psychic, his use of remote viewing to locate oil wells in order to fund ESP research.
Yes, I remember that was supposed to happen, but it
So
didn't happen.
Mark says that he just learned that $1 million was donated to Bill Roll's Psychic Research Foundation. So I think he's answering your question from a couple months ago. Do you know anything about that?
From the Ireland Foundation?
It doesn't say, but it was to Bill Rolls.
I know Bill Roll, who created a foundation. Roll died some years ago, and I didn't know that the foundation still exists.
So I guess the comment was to say Mark's dad used remote viewing to locate an oil well in order to fund ESP research.
Ireland did that.
Yeah, Richard.
That's what he was going. We had a big meeting in a hotel where he was going to start an organization to do that. And our meeting was quite lavish for parapsychologists, at least. It was in a fancy downtown. Anyway, I didn't know that anything happened to that. I'm glad they were able to support Bill Roll.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question I'm going to combine two, which is, what are your thoughts on the nature of reality, and has it influenced your thoughts on the afterlife?
Well, I think that we live in a multidimensional space-time, which I'm not going to tell you about now. If you want to know about that, you can read my book, The Reality of ESP. I did not create extra dimensions. This is something I did with Elizabeth Rauscher. We just feel that all the dimensions there are already complex. And what that means is that for your consciousness, there will always be a path through space-time from the coordinates where you are right now to any other coordinate in the distance or in the future. So your consciousness can always find a path through space-time to experience what's going on there. And that meets our data. As far as we know, there are no inhibitions or no limits on how far into the distance you can see. For example, Ingo Swann was able to describe Jupiter with no problem, 500 million miles away, and Charles Leadbeater could look into a block of paraffin and describe the structure of a hydrogen atom. So that's like looking at the alpha and the omega. You can look at things infinitely far away or infinitely small, no problem. And people also, Bob Monroe was very interested in traveling on the astral plane psychically. In fact, he thought that he met his wife on the astral plane. So it's as though consciousness penetrates everything. You can look, permeates everything. That you can use your consciousness to look inside a hydrogen atom. You can use your consciousness to look at a weapons factory in the Soviet Union. Similarly, if your consciousness permeates everything, then you can find a boyfriend or a girlfriend on the astral plane, and your love permeates everything as well, because love is part of consciousness. So if you're able to move your awareness through space-time uninhibited, there's no reason why you be surprised to be able to move your loving intentions through space-time. So I would think that since the data is excellent for consciousness permeating everything, I would expect love to be able to do the same.
That is a great place for us to leave that. I 100% agree with you, and I think most people would agree with you. So I want to just thank you. I thank everybody who's here, who's listening and watching. Thank you, Russell. This is really wonderful, and thank you to Jonathan Womack as well for sharing his film of your interview.
You should tell people that if they want to see this film again, it's available on Amazon Prime streaming. So if you're a member, if you belong to Amazon Prime, you can watch this film at no cost.
The Womack film or yours?
To me?
The Jonathan Womack's film, the interview we just did?
The interview, the name of the interview we just did is Limitless Mind with Russell Targ.
Okay. And your film is called Third Eye Spies.
Yes.
And it is available.
And that's also streaming on Amazon.
Okay.
And
okay.
That's also free if you belong to Amazon.
Okay, so check it out, everyone. If you haven't seen it yet, it's really good. Lots of great information. So thank you again. Just want to wish everybody a great night.
And thank you, Mary, for setting this all up.
Thank you, Mary. And have a good weekend. Stay well, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you.